All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Chris Menapace. I am Vice President of the Wallingford Historic Preservation Trust. That's what I do in the evenings and on the weekends, but during the day, I'm actually working for Discovering Amistad. Not here in that capacity, but my day job is an educator, teaching about the stories of the Amistad Rebellion. So very linked to what we're going to be talking about here, which is the history, of the enslaved and free Black population here in Wallingford. So I don't know how familiar people are with the Wallingford Historic Preservation Trust, but I joined them as an independent researcher a little over a year ago now, 2 years ago now. It's hard to remember with the pandemic, everything kind of just, fogs together. I can't really keep it straight, but this is one of the properties, the Royce House, right on Main Street, South Main Street, Jerry, right? North Main Street, sorry. And then, so let me give you, start off by giving you a little bit of details of this project, the Black Stories Matter project that I've been working on for a while now, and will continue to work on for a while longer. So the scope of the project is to look at the history of slavery and early free Black population of Wallingford, Cheshire, and Meriden, so greater Wallingford. I'll be trying to highlight a little bit more of Wallingford here since that's where we are at the moment. The goal is to uncover the purposely neglected history of Wallingford's Black residents, both enslaved and free in the town's early history. Now, I use that wording on purpose, the purposely neglected. If you ever go and read any of the town histories of Wallingford or really any colonial New England town, there's maybe a paragraph on slavery and they talk about how benevolent and great it was and it wasn't really bad at all. And of course, I'm here to kind of debunk that if it really needed debunking at all. Through this research project that we've been working on for a while now, it looked at census records, church records, vital records, military, town histories, and all sorts of kind of miscellaneous records here and there. We'll never probably uncover all of the records pertaining to this history. And there are other historians that are doing something like this for different towns. As far as I know, there's nobody for Wallingford that has uncovered as much as this, but I digress. This is another one of the properties that the trust owns, the Johnson House. That one's built in the 1860s, so it's not linked to this history, but I did want to highlight it as this is, this project is due to the Wallingford Historic Preservation Trust. Now, before I continue, I will have time for questions. Since we have a lot of people in person and on Zoom, I'll probably stop at certain points and ask you for questions. I usually like to just stop when people have the questions then, but I think, we have an hour, so I don't think we'll have time for all of that. And so a little bit of just the big number things that this project has uncovered. So we have found data points for over 400 enslaved people in between Wallingford, Cheshire, and Meriden. Now, when I say data points, I don't say people simply because a lot of these records don't have people's names. And you'll see that. I'll show you a couple examples. I'll use the language in the record, just so you know. So it might say buried in 1771, Negro servant of so-and-so. So I don't know exactly who that was. So one of those other data points might be the same person, but I really don't know. That's why I use the term data points though. 400 unique data points. And you'll see a lot of people I do know the name of. And these records date from as early as 1706, over 300 years ago, until the end of enslavement in Connecticut in 1848. So that's almost 150-year time frame. Now, of course, this is not a definitive list in any means. I would be shocked if there was not an enslaved person before 1706. But as the town progressed, the records got better. And so the earlier you get, the less detailed or complete these records are.
I apologize. I forgot to have you share your screen so people
Oh,
can see the
of
slides.
course.
That is my fault completely. I apologize. So, intermission, 5 minutes after we started. Thank you very much for waiting. I'm
So
sorry
I'm
about
not
that.
in the Zoom.
That's okay. So, I'm just gonna. You have Zoom on here?
I think so.
Yep, you do. This is the kind of professional presentation you can expect from. I'm just.
Well, we're
joking.
gonna get used to it, right?
Yes, I apologize. This is my.
Imagine that pretty much all events like this from now on are gonna be hybrid.
I just. I'll give you the name. I'm sorry, folks. This is
It's no problem. Any questions so far that I can answer while we're doing this? Yes.
The total population of Wallingford should be at this time.
Well, it depends what time we're looking at since it's such a wide frame. I'll have a couple points that I'll point out.
In other words, if you have a census for 1782.
Yeah, I pulled up numbers. I don't have them memorized, but I'll share those numbers, you know, have a comparison. I think it's 1762. I do, because that was the peak of enslavement in Wallingford, or at least as far as we know, the most enslaved people number wise and percentage wise in the town. So I'll have those numbers in a little bit. Yeah.
What was the 1706 event or happening?
So I'll go over that. Yeah. So Abijah Prince was the enslaved person record of, and I'll go over him in a little bit more detail in a minute. I saw another hand up. Yes. It's in Mystic right now. It was in New Haven about a month ago. And of course, that's a similar time frame that we're looking at, right? You know, Amistad came to Connecticut in 1839, and this goes, you know, these records go all the way to 1848. And the reason why the Amistad ship came to Connecticut once it was captured by the U.S. Navy is because slavery was still legal here. And the U.S. Navy captain that captured the Amistad wanted to keep the, you know, salvage laws. He wanted to keep the property, and he was hoping that the property would be considered the kidnapped Africans. That's how both my jobs relate. Works great.
Just go to the
And I'll just
presentation.
minimize this.
Yeah, you know how to do that. Thank you, everybody.
All right, so also part of this was uncovering structures, properties linked to enslavement in the town, and I'll go over some of those as well, but over a dozen structures directly linked to enslavement. What that means is a place an enslaved person lived, was enslaved, worshipped, was buried, things like that. And I'll pull up plenty of examples. So before I get into all of that, though, I want to give a little bit more background on Connecticut slavery and the Connecticut slave trade. So, of course, we have to begin that story in Africa. Overall, the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, had 12 million African victims, meaning 12 million people kidnapped from West Africa, mainly West Africa, and brought to the Americas, North and South America. 3 million of those people, those Africans, died on the Middle Passage. Only 400,000 of that 12 million were transported to the United States, and even fewer the North. You're talking very low numbers. And I have a little website here, just a very, very quick time lapse. And this is going over all of the ships in the slave trade. So you can see just how many ships there were. And if you look to North America, There's only a couple when it is comparable to Brazil or the Caribbean. If you look at Connecticut, you'll see almost no ships come up here. Now, these, of course, is just the records of the ships. There are plenty of ships that have no records of them. But I just wanted to give you an idea of the scale that we're talking about here. This is the slave trade in the North definitely existed and was an integral part of the economy, but it was not nearly as central as it was to places like the Caribbean. And the purpose of the slave trade was to dehumanize people, to destroy their identities and turn human beings into property. And that, of course, was true even of the more limited slave trade that came here to Connecticut. Africans were not allowed to speak their native language. They were not able to practice their religion, follow their culture, or even keep their names in many cases. And that, of course, is very linked to the research project that I've done here, is that these are often biblical names that are given to them, or Anglican names, not birth names. Now, that being said, parts of these multitude of African cultures, mainly West African cultures, that were brought over through the Middle Passage through the people that were kidnapped, do survive in some way with current African American culture, kind of a blend of African and American cultures. And so I want to give that little background there to humanize an enslaved person more than we typically do. And you might notice I use the term enslaved instead of slave, because slave is a title, enslaved is a condition. And so long before these kidnapped Africans were ever kidnapped, they had their own lives, names, religion, families, and their own identities. And that did not completely go away when they were kidnapped and brought to places like Connecticut. An identity is how you view yourself and how you are viewed by others. So these enslaved people were fathers, mothers, wives, husbands, farmers, warriors, all of these different things that defined them. Enslaved was one thing that defined them, not everything. And so that's why I use the term enslaved. And of course, this was true of people not born in Africa, born into slavery here in Connecticut, that they had their own identity beyond just being, put into slavery. It was not the end all be all of who they were. And I use the example of Sangbe Pie here from the Amistad, as this portrait kind of shows. He was kidnapped, but what you see in that image is a noble figure, a leader, a strong individual, more than just being enslaved. Now, when talking about Wallingford's link to Africa, I'm going to kind of use this one man, Catham, as kind of my thematic thread throughout this entire presentation, because his life story hits on many of the aspects that I'll talk about today. So Catham was born in Africa, most likely West Africa, around 1750. When he was 5 years old, he was kidnapped by a group of men. They offered him his freedom if he would go and bring back his friend Cato. When Catham did this, the kidnappers took Catham and Cato and sold them into slavery. During the Middle Passage, Catham refused to eat. Remember, the 5-year-old boy at this point. He thought that his captors were cannibals and they would eat him. And this document you see on the right is actually a newspaper article from the Record Journal from 1900 talking about Catham's life. And that's where this story comes from. Talking about Connecticut in general, I don't know how familiar people are with the Connecticut slave trade, but the major ports in Connecticut were Middletown, where I live, and New London. And most of the time, the people sold to Connecticut were people that did not sell in the Caribbean. So the ship would purchase kidnapped Africans in places like Limboko off the coast of West Africa, go to Caribbean, sell as many as they could, and whatever they couldn't sell, come to Connecticut. And oftentimes, or just up the coast. And oftentimes the sailors and captains of these ships were from the north. Rhode Island, I think, was one of the biggest producers of captains of slave ships. And Connecticut, of course, had a major role in that. And I'll go over some Wallingford examples. If you want to know more about this, though, the Middlesex Historical Society did a large project on this in 2016. And there's a plaque now next to the river in Middletown identifying, the site where ships would be offloaded. So this is just a log book from that exhibit. Now, thinking of Wallingford in the slave trade, as I mentioned before, there were men in Wallingford that were captains of these ships, owners of the ships, crew of the ships. Two of the most notorious were David and Phineas Cook, Phineas being David Cook's son. Now, David Cook owned several ships, and his son was the captain, one of his captains of his ships. You'll see on the right there a runaway slave ad put up by David Cook. Runaway slave ads were incredibly common, even up here in Connecticut. I'll show you a lot of examples. So if you ever get access to newspapers, old newspapers, look for runaway slave ads. You'll see them everywhere. And so I'll read a little bit of it, but ran away on the 10th of June. This is blocking it right here. From David Cook of Wallingford, a mulatto manservant named Tony, 26 years old, and talks about a little bit of his physical stature. So this was 1761. Now I'm going to tell you a pretty famous story for Wallingford at the time that involved David and Phineas that kind of got that notorious name. The Cooks were, and still are, very wealthy and prestigious family. There's a Cook Street, I think, in Wallingford. Cooks are one of the prominent Wallingford families. You're going to see a lot of prominent Wallingford families from this time period listed here. And so in 1755, while in the Caribbean, Phineas kidnapped a free man named Joseph DeMink. Now, it's up for debate. I've seen sources say one thing and other sources say another, but he was either biracial or white. That didn't matter to Phineas and David, though, who sold Joseph as a black slave in Connecticut. And you notice the 2-year time discrepancy. In 1757, Joseph goes to the General Assembly, wins his freedom, as he was born a free man in Portugal, the Portuguese Caribbean. And so he's still enslaved, though, for 2 years before he wins his freedom. And so this was a really big story in the 1750s in Wallingford and gave the Cooks a pretty bad name. Of course, they were still wealthy and had plenty of positions and power. I'll stop here. Any questions so far? Yes.
These ships that came over from Africa, you said they were largely captured by folks from New York.
Yeah, I don't know an exact percentage, but a huge chunk.
Is, did these ships also supply slaves to the other United States? Or did they have their own ships?
Yeah, they supplied it pretty much anywhere. If you go to that website I showed before, which I'll just show you the link. If you go to slavevoyages.org, they have a full list of, I think it's 40-odd thousand records of slave ships. And some of them are pretty detailed. Some of them are a little bit more vague, but all those dots you saw, they were different colors because that was the country of origin. So, there were plenty of US ships in that mix, and that didn't necessarily mean they came back to the US. For example, I'll mention the Amistad again, but, the ship that actually brought the 53 kidnapped, well, it was 500 at that point, kidnapped Africans was a Portuguese ship, but it brought them to Cuba. So country of origin didn't really have 100% distinction of where they were going. So I hope that answers your question.
So the South, did they actually have their own trade?
Yep. It would be a similar way that they would stop at the Caribbean first and then go to the South.
Yeah.
But, you know, there are plenty of ships going to the South. I think Savannah was the main port. Oh no, Charleston, I think, was the main port. And of course, they're getting way more kidnapped Africans than the North is. And just because the slave trade was made illegal didn't stop them. I think the last slave ship that went to the United States was like 1860, a full like 50 years after the slave trade is abolished in the United States. So just because it was illegal doesn't mean it wasn't happening. I mean, you see David and Phineas right there, they're breaking the law, kidnapping a free man. They didn't get away with it this time, but who knows how many people they did that same thing for. Yes.
When you mentioned them going to the Caribbean before they came here, the Caribbean was still completely colonized.
Yep.
You know, to be clear, we think of the Caribbean, you may not think of it as the colonies of
Yes.
English,
France, England, Spain.
Spain, Portugal, but
Yep.
they were going there because they were still colonies.
Exactly.
Coming west here.
Yep. I see a couple of questions in chat. Okay. So getting more into Connecticut slavery, just a little bit of background before I really dive into the details for Wallingford. But Connecticut slavery began in 1637, so almost 400 years ago, after the Pequot War. And the first enslaved people here in Connecticut were actually captured Pequot men, women, and children that were taken during that Pequot War. They were sold to the Caribbean, and this kind of began, though they were sold for African captives. So that really began slavery in Connecticut. And for Connecticut, 1774, Connecticut reaches the highest total of enslaved people in the state at 5,101. Now, a little caveat to that number, in 1774, obviously we're not our own country yet. This is more of an index than a full census. And they are not distinguishing between free and enslaved population. But 1774, almost all, not all, but almost all Africans are at this point, you know, they might have been here for generations. So most of them, almost all, were enslaved. In 1784, Connecticut passes gradual emancipation, meaning that after the law is passed, anyone who reaches 21, if you're born, say, you know, law goes into effect, I think it was January 1st, 1784. So if you're born January 10th, 1784, at the age of 21, you would be free. But if you were born in 1783, you would still be enslaved for life. Now, finally, in 1748, the last few remaining enslaved people, there's about a dozen at that time, are freed by Connecticut, fully banning slavery. So we're talking about over 200 years of slave history in Connecticut. The man on the right you see is James Mars. I just use him as a famous example. He's one of the few, him and Venture Smith are the only ones, I believe, to have written their own kind of biographies of their time being enslaved in Connecticut. And James Mars lived well into the 19th century, so there's actual photograph of him. But, you know, he was freed by gradual emancipation, but his enslaver actually tried to get him to move out of state by taking his mother, I believe it was, to Virginia, and saying, if you ever want to see your mother again, you have to be enslaved by me here in Virginia. He did not go to Virginia. But we'll talk about him a little bit more later. Now, here we'll really get into Wallingford specifically. As I mentioned, the earliest known record that I have found of an enslaved person being in Wallingford was 1706, a man named Abijah Prince, who was enslaved by Reverend Benjamin Doolittle. Now, Abijah Prince was actually pretty well known because of who he married. He married a woman named Lucy Prince, who became the first published African-American woman. Abijah Prince and Lucy eventually gained their freedom and become one of the first settlers of Vermont. And when Lucy was still enslaved as a teenager, she published a poem. So I mentioned, 1762, the most enslaved people in Wallingford that I could find, a Connecticut index census shows 182 enslaved people in Wallingford, but that same caveat as the previous one, it just does not distinguish between free and enslaved, but at this point, pretty much everyone is enslaved. Now, I suspected that question, so let me go to my notes on here, because I'm pretty sure I put the numbers, the exact percentage and everything on there. No. It's on a future slide, sorry. But, you're talking about a population of Wallingford in the thousands at this point. So 182 people was pretty significant portion of the population. We're not talking like even 5%, but, larger than many people would imagine. The last enslaved person in Wallingford was in 1848. Unfortunately, the record that showed this did not list their name, only their enslaver is J. Parker. And some of the most prolific enslavers in the town's history were people like Elihu Hall, and I'll probably be mispronouncing some names, Joseph Hall, Samuel Hugh, and Noah Yale. So you recognize probably some prominent names in that, and we'll mention a lot of them throughout. So to compare, because this is a question I get a lot, what slavery looked like here in the North versus what slavery looked like in the South. You did not have these massive plantations you would imagine, although there were a couple in Connecticut, not in the Wallingford area, more in the Salem area. You would see much smaller groups of enslaved people. The largest enslaver I know in 1790 in Wallingford enslaved 8 people. So still a significant number, but nothing like you saw in the South. And it was not as delegated, you worked in the fields or you worked in the house like we imagine the South to be. If you were enslaved by Philemon Johnson, as you see on this slide, you do anything that Johnson said, whether it was chop wood, work on the farm, clean the house. It was not delegated to specific tasks. The labor, of course, was still very harsh. In fact, in New York, they've found a lot of graves from this time period. I'm talking about mid-18th century of enslaved people. And they've looked at the skeletons, and you can usually tell how healthy a person is by their skeletal remains. And you're seeing like arthritis in people as young as like 18 to 20. And based upon where they're getting arthritis, what joints, you can tell basically what kind of labor they were doing. So the labor up here in Connecticut was very, very harsh. And Connecticut, of course, had its own black codes, as you might have heard of before. Laws ruling how a free or enslaved black person could live in Connecticut, whether it was punishments for disobedience or libel, or if it was, New London at one point had a law on the books in the colonial time period that said if a free black person wanted to purchase land in New London, they needed the town's permission to do so. So there were laws that free and enslaved black people need to live by, very similar to what you might have seen in southern states. And this newspaper article you see on the right is Philemon Johnson selling a 23-year-old woman in 1771, and this was put in the newspaper. So if you're reading the newspaper in this time period, which you definitely were, you would see these runaway slave ads, and you'd also see these for sale ads. And this is a perfect example, though, of how difficult this research can be, because there's no name associated. It is just a 23-year-old black woman, no name associated with her whatsoever. So it's really difficult to track specific people down and see what their life was like. Questions so far? Yes.
Did any of the founders of Wallingford bring slaves with them?
So the very early history, I've not uncovered any record of the first founders of Wallingford. You know, that earliest record I have is 1706, although their descendants did. Slavery in the Americas really didn't begin until after the founding of most of these towns, these early towns in Connecticut and the South. You know, if you look at the first enslaved people, African enslaved people in the entire America or North America, that's 1619, right? Years after the colony really began. So as I've kind of been pointing out throughout, one of the most difficult things in this research is tracking people through time, rather than just finding data points. Most of the people, even if a name is given, it is not a family name. It is just a first name. And oftentimes they did not have a family name. Once freed, a Black family would take up a name, and it could be the last name of the person who freed them, the person who enslaved them, the town they were born, a completely new name. You see a lot of freedoms, freemans, liberties, things like that. And some of the families that we have had success looking into were people like the Freemans, the Prinns, the Naamans, and the Smiths. And I'll talk about most of them through the presentation. And this growing free Black community after the turn of the Revolution, this growing free Black community here in Wallingford, they're very closely knit. They're really marrying together. You see this little diagram here. You have Catham, who I'm going to continue to bring up throughout, his wife, his children, and then some of his children marry, and his daughter Catherine marries Robin Prynne, one of these other families. And his son takes up the last name Smith. So there's connections to a lot of these families that you do know the family name to.
Question in chat.
Mhm.
Did your research indicate where in Wallingford the free Black community was?
It's kind of hard to locate. If it was a specific location, there are some clusters in Meriden, for example. I don't know if there is one specific free Black community in one specific area. But looking at the land records from this time, you would see, you know, it wouldn't be a street address. It would be, you know, this property is bounded on the west by this other guy's property, and to the north by this other property, and to the south, maybe you might get a creek or something like that. So it's difficult to match, but I wouldn't say there was one grouped up. When I say closely knit, it's more relationship wise than physical place. So one of the interesting stories, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm interested in hearing about my grandfather's name is Edward Naaman, and my name is Carolyn Kelly. The reason I'm here is because there's a recent article about Ellen Alonzo Washington, who was my great grandfather, who was born in 1849 in Virginia, and a gentleman. He was a policeman or something. He became a citizen of Wallingford. So this woman wrote an article this past summer, and it has been so eye-opening for me. And here you say the name Naaman.
Yeah, I'd be happy, you know, to exchange emails with you afterwards so I can give you more information, because it's more than I can present to you right now. But there's a considerable amount of I found about the Naaman family. I know they moved to Southington after they gained freedom, and there's all these records in Southington with the Naaman family. A few names, Caesar Naaman, which I think is a recurring name because I think he has a grandson named Julius Caesar Naaman. So I can give you some of that information later on, because I don't have it all memorized. There's just so much. That's great to hear, though, that see these connections. So one of the interesting stories that came out of this research, and it was actually done by another historian, I found the article online, So I don't want to take credit for all of this or anything like that. There has been research done by other historians that I am building upon. So a man named Dick Bristol, who was enslaved in Cheshire until 1781. So part of that being Wallingford, because I think Cheshire gains its freedom in 1780. He was freed by the town after serving in the army for 3 years. He married a woman named Rhoda, who was a Native American woman who was illegally enslaved by Joseph Hall in Wallingford. They had 4 children: Lily, Hampton, George, and Peter. Rhoda was born free, but like I said, had been illegally kidnapped, and enslavement followed the mother. So if your mother was enslaved, but your father was free, it wouldn't matter, you would be enslaved. And so her children were considered enslaved, even though she was illegally enslaved. And so she goes to the courts about this because she knows she's illegally enslaved. And so that's a path to freedom we'll expand upon a little bit more that really wasn't available to people in the South for the most part. So she goes to the courts to try to gain her and her children's freedom. And in the meantime, in 1791, 5 armed white men led by Roger Riley from Wethersfield entered Dick and Rhoda's home and kidnapped 2 of her children, Lily and George. After she's gone through the courts, won her freedom for her and her children, in 1792, the court, with the power of the courts, they armed 3 black men: Philip, who was free; Joseph Prynne, one of those families I mentioned. And the Prynnes actually lived in Wallingford, partially Wallingford, partially Wethersfield, actually. Joseph Prynne, who was enslaved by John Webb, and Jack, who was enslaved by Moseph Royce. They armed themselves with clubs and successfully rescued Lily and George. And so this article you see on the right is actually a letter from Yale University, part of their collection of the Baldwin family papers, in 1791 by some of the allies of Rhoda Bristol, trying to recruit some legal assistance, some monetary assistance to regain the freedom of her children who had been kidnapped. And so what was interesting about this research, when I talked to the historian who uncovered it, who was a librarian at the Connecticut State Library, was that this did not make the newspapers. This was not like a big story like that Joseph Demink story I told you earlier. This was really only uncovered in letters. So there's so much history that we don't know because it just really wasn't talked about. Nobody really wanted to mention that this was happening. Well, I say nobody, none of the white people wanted to talk about this was happening. So when talking about the enslavers in Wallingford, pretty much every prominent family that you can imagine in Wallingford history was an enslaver. The Yales, of course, the big name in Yale University. Noah Yale was an enslaver that lived in Wallingford, and then eventually became Meriden. And you see this runaway slave ad of a man named Elihu Yale, who's putting out an ad in 1803 for an enslaved man named Richard Wood, who was only about 19 years old. And in the 1800 census, or in the 1790 census, he had 8 enslaved people. So he had a lot of enslaved people. Now Noah Yale enslaved a man named Catham, as well as Catham's wife Maria and their son Jude. I mentioned that, and we'll get back to why I mentioned that. The wealthier the family was, of course, the more likely they were to enslave other people. One example, the Brocketts, Mary and Titus. Titus passed away a few years before his wife, so when Mary Brockett died, she left money, property, and items to their Anglican church, St. Paul's of Wallingford. One of those items you see on the right is a silver chalice that's still in the possession of the church now. And the inscription on there is the gift of Captain Titus Brockett. It was easier to read when I was at home looking at it, but for the church in Wallingford, 1764. In that same will that leaves all these items to the church. They also free Grace and Esau in 1777, two of the people that her and her husband were enslaving. Grace and Esau were husband and wife and continued to live in Wallingford well into the 19th century. Of course, as I continue to mention, it's really difficult to talk about what happened to them. As you notice, there's no family name. So I have a potential. In a census record, there's a free black man named Esau Brockett. I don't know. So one of the most common professions in Connecticut that would be an enslaver was a reverend, a priest. One of these was Samuel Andrews, as you see this portrait of here. He was a native of Wallingford and the rector of the Anglican church in town. And he was a loyalist, which led to his house arrest during the American Revolution. And you see this candlestick. There's a close-up of it. It says, given to St. Paul's Church, Wallingford, in memory of Reverend Samuel Andrews, sometimes rector of this parish. There's also a table that he had there. So these are just some of the items we still have of this history. Another reverend in town who, if you know anything, if you know a lot about this time period, you'll recognize the name James Dana. He was actually became an abolitionist later in life, but this record here, which is a church burial record from 1770, it says, burying Dinah, servant of James Dana, at 15. So meaning she was 15 years old when she died. So even though later in life he preached against the evils of slavery in 1770, he was an enslaver himself. Any questions? Yes.
And out of curiosity, Reverend Samuel Andrews, any connection to the Andrews homestead in Meriden?
It's a very common name, so I would have to look into that more. I don't know. It very much could be. The Andrews are still around, for a long time after this. I know at the trust we have a portrait of one of his descendants, John Andrews, for example. So I would not be surprised if there's a link. Yes.
Who were the two Yale people there? Were they connected to Yale University?
Yeah, so pretty much any Yale you talk about is connected to the university. The man the university is named after is Elihu Yale, not the Elihu Yale that I talked about, an earlier man named Elihu Yale, but it's the same family. They're like cousins. So it is the family that is connected to Yale University. So there's a branch that lived in Wallingford for a very long time, I believe still to today. Elihu Yale, the man the university names after, goes to India and is like a governor there. Speaking of enslavers, though, it didn't have to be an enslaver to be an anti-abolitionist. I grew up here in Connecticut. I grew up in South Windsor. And whenever we talked about the history of slavery for the North, we talked about how Connecticut was a free state, abolitionists, Underground Railroad, we're done. That's the only thing you talk about, right? None of this what I've talked about before, and none of this anti-abolitionist sentiment that was pretty prevalent here in the North. And here's a specific example from Meriden. Even though it's 1837, there's almost no enslaved people. There are still some, but there's almost no enslaved people here in Connecticut anymore, but there's still a sizable anti-abolitionist population. And these could be people that are just making money off of the slavery. The cotton being harvested in the South had to go somewhere. It was often where the factories here in the North. But in 1837, in the basement of this church, Center Congregational Church in Meriden, which was built in 1830, there was a meeting of the Abolitionist Society, the Anti-Slavery Society. Well, an anti-abolitionist mob broke down the door with a tree trunk and began to pelt the abolitionists with rocks and eggs, breaking up the meeting. So as you can clearly see by this example, it was not this uniform, free-loving society that we imagined in Connecticut. There's, of course, plenty of abolitionists, but there's plenty of people against abolition, and more likely than not, the majority is somewhere in between. So looking at locations today, keep in mind there are more structures that I'm going to mention, and that does not include properties for the most part, other than this first one here. So, I might know of a house that existed at some point that was built by an enslaver. So an enslaved person lived there, which one thing I should mention, there are very few cases of slave cabins up here in the North. More likely than not, they'd be sleeping in the same house as their enslaver in a separate room. So just want to get that out of the way. So keep in mind when I talk about these places, these are places that are still used today, whether private residences, burials for loved ones and family, and places of worship that are still used today. So you see right here, Center Street Cemetery. I'm sure you've driven by it plenty of times. That church record, and tons of church records like this one here are from Center Street Cemetery. The First Congregational Church, you're burying people in Center Street Cemetery for the most part. You won't find a single gravestone for an enslaved person, though. You'll find plenty of enslavers. And one specific example I have is Caleb Merriman, who dies, I think, 1766 of smallpox. Well, he died the same day of his enslaved person, Tull, also dying of smallpox. Caleb gets a gravestone, Tull does not. More likely than not, most of these cemeteries had a poor person's lot where the people would just be buried in a corner with no gravestone. And this was not specifically reserved for enslaved people, but that's where all enslaved people would go, and anyone who couldn't afford a gravestone. And so don't know exactly where that is in the cemetery. And if you've ever tried to dig something up in Wallingford, especially human remains from a long time ago, there's nothing left. If you tried to find human remains from somebody from the 1700s, you might find the nails of their coffin, but you wouldn't even find the wood, probably not the bones, but just the nails probably. The soil in the Connecticut Valley is very acidic. So it's hard to imagine, but there are probably stacks and stacks of, people buried all through Connecticut cemeteries from this time period. If a gravestone disappeared, they would just use the plot again. Another property, and I'm going to move a little bit quicker because I'm going a little bit long. First Congregational Church in Cheshire. And I'm just going to cite my evidence for this. Of course, they weren't enslavers to the church at this time. 1830, that would have been rare, but enslavers worshipped somewhere. And oftentimes they would bring their enslaved. And in fact, I saw records of this online, and I'm trying to get in contact with the church. They have slave pews left over. I don't know from this church or from the previous structure. I'm not sure. I have to get in contact with them. That means that there were enslaved people worshiping at this site. And that 1830 record is just an example of somebody who was an enslaver living in the town and could have worshiped here with his enslaved people. Some of these are private residences. I've kind of gotten rid of the address because I don't want that. But this structure is owned by Choate here in Wallingford. This is the Atwater College, and in 1800 census in Wallingford, Caleb Atwater, who the structure is named after and built the structure, is listed as having one enslaved person. I just took a quick shot of this, but the column all the way to the right in the censuses of that time period, that was the column for enslaved people. And it didn't list names or anything like that. It just was the head of the households and categories of people. And this, of course, was actually his general store, not his home, Caleb Atwater. So the products being sold at this general store were, produced in part by his enslaved person. Another structure, private residence, Theophilus Jones. This one's, I believe, on the National Registry, and it's kind of already known that there were enslaved people here. But just for further evidence, there's this runaway slave ad you see here put out by Theophilus Jones for a man named Alexander, 19 years old, that he was enslaving. So those are just a couple examples. Homes, stores, churches, cemeteries, things like that. I have way more than that. Now I want to talk a little bit about resistance. Enslaved people were not passive in their oppression. They did things to overcome this, and we've seen examples. Running away, a key and common example of resistance to enslavement. And we see this article here from 1803. A woman named Betty, 19 years old, running away from her enslaver, J. Armour, in Wallingford. Now, there's tons of these. There's actually, they just came out, I don't know if it's just, I just discovered it. There's a whole New England database of runaway slave ads that you can look at. There's a few I have that they don't, so I'll give them to that. But here's just a quick showing of just how many I have, and this is not all of them. I only chose the ones for Wallingford. There's Meriden and Cheshire ones I'm not going to show. Samuel Root, actually, sorry, not Samuel Root. He put out the ad, but the runaway in 1759 was from Joseph Hall, living in Wallingford, an enslaved man named Caesar, 26 years old. Runaway Cuff, 23 years old, from Charles Hull. Not Charles Hall. There's a Charles Hall house, but it's a Charles Hull, different family. A 25-year-old Black woman named Jin, running away from Elijah Scoville, 1787. This is one of the interesting ones. Most of the time when you see these runaway ads, you have no idea what happened to Jin after this ad went out. They don't put up a record afterwards saying we captured Jin or Jin was never found. We have no idea. Maybe Jin made it to freedom in Canada or Massachusetts or somewhere else. We have absolutely no idea. This is one of the rare examples where we do know, because this is actually an ad put out by a man named Mr. Robert Wilson in Massachusetts, saying, I have captured an enslaved person named Jack, who says he is enslaved by Mr. Nathaniel Curtis of Wallingford. So this is one of the rare instances we actually do know what happened. Another runaway from Joseph Hall we saw earlier. This one doesn't even say his name. Who's escaping? Just says a 26-year-old mulatto slave. That's all it says. It's 1759. $10 reward for Thomas Freeman, who ran away from Elida Parker. Runaway William, 19 years old, from John Hull, 1796. So again, I have more than that, and that was a lot. There are plenty, and there's plenty I haven't even found at all, because not all newspapers from this time period have these records, or at least not accessible. This one is a really interesting story that was actually in a town history of Meriden, and it is an oral history written down at the time, which is, the book is written in the late 19th century. I'm going to read it word for word for you. So this oral history was told to the author Gillespie by Willard Hall and his sister Mrs. Gallup about Parson Hall, most likely but not confirmed Elihu Hall. As already noted, Parson Hall had 5 slaves, and his story has come down to the present day, which is without much doubt based on fact. In the days when the parish still worshipped in the little church on Meeting House Hill, the parson, which by the way, parson is just a church title, the parson was the owner of a slave who was surly and unruly, and whom it was sometimes necessary to chastise. One Sunday morning, the parson was obliged to whip his Negro, then went to his duties at the church. Someone saw what looked like a fire at Mr. Hall's house, which could be seen from the church. So the congregation hastily adjourned, and on reaching the house, found that the surly Negro had set fire to a hayrick closely adjoining it. For a time, it looked as if the house would be destroyed, but by hard work it was saved. A short time later, this Negro climbed into a chestnut tree in the southern part of the farm, and falling, broke his neck. So, this is a pretty amazing story that has come down. And if you notice, they don't give the name of the enslaved person, because most likely for the people telling the story, the most important detail was their ancestor, the Hall, Parson Hall. But you have an example of an attempted arson and a suicide. And both of these are acts of resistance. Destruction of property or tools was very common, and suicide was very common, although not often recorded. Do anything you could to avoid being enslaved and even taking your own life. This is especially common actually in the slave trade. They had nets on the sides of slave ships to stop people from jumping overboard. Another form of resistance was the court case. We've already talked about Rhoda Bristol, able to win her freedom and her children's freedom through the court, but another very similar case, an eerily similar case from only 2 years later, 1793, for Wallingford. Two white men, John Ives and Joel Moss of Wallingford, kidnapped the daughter of Peter Elkay, a free Black man from Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Peter sued John and Joel and went to the New Haven courts and was able to have his daughter released and returned to him, and actually was able to win damages, $250 from each man, $500 in total. And so that's a newspaper article from 1793 from the Connecticut Journal talking about this. But that's two examples in a 3-year span. I have a feeling that there are a lot more stories like this that aren't told. But there are cases, courts actually being used to resist enslavement, whether it was legal or illegal. I mentioned the Amistad, another famous example of using the courts for resistance. So my last little section here, and again, I'm going quick because it's 8 o'clock already. Talking a little bit about the free Black community after enslavement. I mentioned that, it really diminishes, the enslaved population really diminishes after the American Revolution, but that's because most people are gaining their freedom. And I'll talk about some of the paths to freedom. We talked about, running away. Where would they go? You think Canada, a common one. Massachusetts, though, that ad saying that somebody was caught was put out in Massachusetts, because Massachusetts was the first of the Connecticut's neighbors to outlaw slavery, and that was in 1783. They didn't do gradual emancipation like Connecticut, they outright outlawed slavery. So that was a common place to go. One of the common paths to freedom was being a soldier in the American Revolution. I mentioned Noah Yale before, but Noah Yale's son was drafted, and in this time you could send a replacement. So Noah Yale offers Catham, who we've mentioned before, his freedom if he would join the army instead of his son. It was very common back then. Catham agreed and served in the Connecticut 4th Regiment from 1777 to 1780. When he returned, he received his freedom, but his wife Maria did not. And that's actually Catham Freeman's pension application dated 1818. He did receive his pension, by the way. Another path to freedom was purchasing their freedom. And again, we'll mention Catham. Catham, once he gained his freedom, could earn his own money, spent years, earning it up to purchase the freedom, but he actually came up with an agreement with Noah Yale. If he worked for a certain number of years for free for Noah Yale, that Noah Yale would free his wife and now their child, Juba. And that's actually from the Wallingford land records, the Freeman family emancipation records. So they took up the name Freeman as their family name. So that is the actual document from 1782, freeing Catham, Maria, and Juba. Even after freedom is achieved, Catham, for one, is not receiving the same freedoms as his white male neighbors. I mentioned those Black codes earlier that even it applied to free Black men and women as well. There were a few instances where Black men in Wallingford were able to vote. And two examples are Jack John and Toby Birdseye. And this is an excerpt from a very long newspaper article from the Connecticut Current in 1803, railing against this decision. The sarcastic universal suffrage title is saying, well, they gave this Black man the right to vote, they're going to give it to everybody. Well, this was a very short-lived freedom for Jack John and Toby Birdseye. who, by the way, were enslaved in Wallingford, gained their freedom, and then were given the right to vote. You had to go before a committee and receive that right. Because the Connecticut Constitution in 1818 explicitly limited suffrage to white men only. So you had the right to vote until 1818. And of course, on the national scale, Massachusetts didn't get rid of the right to vote for free Black men until the Dred Scott decision in the 1850s. Made it illegal federally. And I mentioned many, many times, it's incredibly difficult to track what happens to these families after they get a family name. Catham, we were able to, track his family, the Freemans, but if you look at this census record, it only lists the head of household. So even if we look at one of the white families, Jonathan Tuttle, only lists Jonathan Tuttle, we know that there are 6 people in his household, 2 adult men, 1 male child, white child, and then 3 females. We have no idea their names. And if they're a renter, if they're renting out a room, we don't even get the family name. So if you had just gained your freedom from being enslaved, you're probably not buying a house. And so for decades, you're lost in the record because they don't start putting every member in that household until I think 1850. So pretty much all of the enslaved population in Connecticut is gone by then. One of the people we do know a lot about in the 19th century, I'm sure you've heard the name Tony Smith, but well, maybe you've heard the name Tony Smith before. But Tony Smith, his ancestors were enslaved here in Wallingford. He was born in Middlefield, Connecticut. His wife was Amy Warner, and Amy Warner's grandfather was Cato Warner, who was enslaved by Major Edward Barker in 1795. So this is a couple generations down the line, but Tony Smith would join the 54th Massachusetts, the first Black regiment in the Civil War. The movie Glory is about this regiment. He fought at that battle, Fort Wagner, and it was injured, and then came back to Wallingford and lived the rest of his days. And that's actually a picture of him and his fife and drum band called the Dreadnoughts, and he is on the far right. That image is owned by the Wallingford Historical Society. All right, last 2 slides, I promise. But obviously, this is an incomplete project that I presented to you. This is some of what I have. I obviously have a lot more. But what the goal of this and our kind of finish date is to continue to do this research, specifically uncover modern day descendants that can connect to this history. We found a couple already of families that have connected to this history. Expanding our collection. You saw that most of my materials are documents. Well, it's not a very exciting exhibit to just have documents, and it's also an incomplete story. We want objects, items, things like that. This is one of the few objects we have. Dick Freedom, who was enslaved in Wallingford, gained his freedom and made powder horns. So this is Dick Freedom's powder horn from 1777. Even when talking about objects, the vast majority of objects left behind are from wealthier people who were the enslavers. So there's a lot to be done, but our plan for the moment is to open an exhibit at the Royce House in June of 2022 to time up with the 350 plus 2 at this point. But that's the end goal of this project. So that's it for me. I'll obviously be around for questions. If you want to email me, there's my email up there, c_menapace@yahoo.com. Yes, I use Yahoo still. Our website for the Wallingford Historic Preservation Trust, wallingfordcthistory.org. If you have research of your own that you'd like to give to me or share, or we can exchange, I'm happy to do that. But yeah, any questions?
I have some in the chat.
Yes.
Right. Mark asked, was abolitionism in Connecticut more prevalent among Federalists or Republicans? What party in the 1830s was more abolitionist?
That unfortunately I can't answer. I'm not an expert at that. I haven't delved too deep into who the abolitionists were and what party was more pro-abolition and more against abolition. My quick answer would just be, I don't think it was purely defined at that point like it was in later times when it's Republicans and Democrats, Republican abolitionists, more likely to be abolitionists and Democrat, pro-slavery. I don't think it was as defined back then.
Don did want to say about the burials. It's interesting because there was often great effort by the enslavers to convert the enslaved to religion, to not give them.
Yeah, and that's a justification of enslavement. The early justification in the 17th century to enslave people is, well, we have to Christianize them. Well, you've Christianized them, you're going to let them go? No. So it was clearly a false pretense.
And how many slaves do you feel were interred in the cemetery?
A lot. I mean, it would be a guess at this point. I have records of, probably dozens, high number, probably not quite 100, but that's just what I have records of. And of course, for every record, there is probably 2 that aren't recorded. So I would say, at a guess, hundreds.
2 more questions from the chat.
Yeah.
And then we get to the rest of the room. Is there any information on the runaway slave, how they survived after running from enslavement? For example, how far did they travel, or were they aided by a sympathizer? So
by the time of, Wallingford and Connecticut slavery, the Underground Railroad isn't really a thing. In the Underground Railroad was only really a loose connection of people working together, no, structure or organization. So you had people helping, you had Quakers from the very beginning who were against slavery. So you would have people that would help, but none of this more formal Underground Railroad you would get in the 19th century. Like I said, my best guess would be Massachusetts. We have that record of a man being captured in Massachusetts because they are the closest and, a free state pretty early on. Canada, you could go to, but Canada at this point has not abolished slavery either. Canada had slavery until the 1830s, because the Great Britain doesn't abolish slavery until I think 1832 or something like that.
Susan wanted to know, is Elihu Hall related to the Dr. Lyman Hall?
Yes, I don't know the exact relation. I have to go in the family tree, but Lyman Hall was related to the Halls of Wallingford, who were pretty prominent enslavers. I don't know, have any record of Lyman, I think, being an enslaver in Wallingford. He was an enslaver when he went to Georgia. But I wouldn't be surprised if I find a record of him owning enslaved people at some point in Wallingford. I don't have that record yet, but.
Finally, were slaves bought and sold in Wallingford, other cities in Connecticut, or were they brought in from other states?
They are bought and sold. I have that record. I'll pull up. I don't remember exactly where it was. I might have gone past it already. There it is. So, you have this record in the newspaper here, to be sold. An unnamed Black woman, enslaved woman at 23 by Philemon Johnson, who is in Wallingford. And he puts this record out in the Connecticut Journal at that time. So you have, it was very common for an enslaved person to have multiple enslavers through their life. You might have a couple from out of the state, brought in through Middletown or New London, which I mentioned. I'm looking at you with the cameras over there. Middletown or New London through the slave trade, but slave trade's outlawed in the United States by like 1810. I don't think that's the exact date, but 1810. So most likely you'd just be from inside the state or a neighboring state. All right, questions for in-person audience. I think you had your hand up first.
Sorry, where is the powder horn?
We have it in our collection at the Wallingford Historic Preservation Trust, and it will definitely be a part of the exhibit. What's that?
It's just in your.
It's in our collection at the moment. It's not on display at the moment. It will be on display when we do the exhibit. Yeah, it was a.
As good as it gets.
Well, they had it before I even arrived, so it's a very unique art.
Revolutionary War.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty unique object, and we're trying all the time to get more. We bid on things that we've lost out on and things like that. But you see very prominently Dick Freedom. I don't know the name after that, but 1777.
Yeah, you showed us a Wallingford emancipation record. How did you have the original, or you got that from a book or some other?
So the record of the Catherine Freeman.
I forgot who it was.
Yeah, so the one I showed was Catherine Freeman. That is the original. That put that in quotes though, because that is the photocopy. But if you go to the Wallingford land records, the records from that time period are all photocopies. But I went to the Wallingford land records, went to volume X to page Y, and it was there. So they might have the original like ink and pen one somewhere, but not on public display. But it is as original I could get access to. And there's plenty more I have from the land records. All right.
I have another check.
Yes.
Looking up people with the Freeman name in Wallingford census records, it seems like they changed addresses frequently. Can you explain that?
Well, first of all, Freeman is an incredibly common name for people who had gained freedom from enslavement, liberated themselves. And you talk about moving. They did not list an address at that time in the early history, so they might be on a different order on the list, but the list of the census records from the 1790 through the 19th century without an address, they're just listing them in the order they talk to people. So I don't know if that answers the question. So it's not so much moving as just the order changing by who the census taker talked to first. All right, well, thank you so much for coming. I'll stick around if anyone has any more questions. Thanks so much for coming, and feel free to send me an email, put it back up again if you have additional questions afterwards. Thank you so much.